Hi guys, welcome to my channel and today's video, which is all about watercolour blooms, how and why they form, how to avoid them, and how I use them to my advantage in a watercolour painting of a clownfish. So I hope you enjoy the video, and if you do, then don't forget to click the like button and consider subscribing if you're new to my channel. All the materials I use will be listed in the description box along with a reference photo I used from Pixabay. So what are watercolour blooms? Well, blooms are formed when you have different degrees of wetness or dryness on your paper, and most people would traditionally try to avoid this. But more recently, as I mentioned in my last turtle painting, they can be used as a design choice in their own right. So in case you're not sure of how watercolour blooms look, I'm going to do a quick demonstration. I swatched out some watercolour paint and then left it to dry for a few minutes, but I didn't let it dry completely. If I now go in and add more water, this will spread out over the damp paint, pushing the pigment with it and create a bloom. The effect may not be immediately obvious and will depend on how much water is added and so on, but it will develop over time as the paper dries again. Close up you can see the effect start to develop, and why these blooms are also described as cauliflowers. To me, these cauliflowers looked a bit like coral, so I found a reference picture on Pixabay that I thought I could use and sketched it out on my watercolour paper. I then outlined the clownfish with masking fluid so I could play around with the background without having to worry about paint or water bleeding onto the areas I wanted to preserve and keep free of paint. Whilst the masking fluid was drying, I mixed up some colours I wanted to use for the background. I started with mineral violet and added in some ultramarine deep. I then mixed up some burnt sienna with some mineral violet. And I add in a bit of burnt umber as well. I wanted the colours to bleed together to give a blurry out of focus background, so I start by pre-wetting my paper using a spray bottle, and then I spread the water out evenly using a flat paintbrush. You don't want to add too much water or else you'll get puddles forming on your paper, so aim for a nice even sheen across it instead. I use my flat brush to begin laying down the paint. This helps me cover a large area quickly and prevents me from worrying too much about details, as it's going to blur out anyway. I use long sweeping strokes with my paintbrush, using my reference photo as a bit of a guide. I decide to add in a more concentrated blue-violet mix and add that to the wet paper too. As much as I'm aiming for a blurry background, I still want a good range of values. And so I decide to go in even darker still. The watercolour will likely dry lighter anyway, so I really want to build in as much depth and contrast as I can now on this first layer. So now I'm happy with that, I go in and add the brown violet mix to the foreground. I have to work quite quickly before the paper dries, so I continue to use my flat brush and loosely drop in the paint. This area of coral is quite different in structure to the blue area that we filled in first, so instead of using long sweeping brush strokes and the edge of my brush, I'm doing more of a stippling motion and just turning and twisting the brush to try and reflect the difference in coral shape. Like before though, as well as having dark areas, I still try and leave some white of the paper to add depth and contrast. I add in some darker values to the brown area using a more concentrated burnt sienna and violet mix. I add this under the clownfish to act as a shadow, and I also put some in where the brown coral meets that blue-violet coral above the fish. At this point I'm using the wet in wet technique, as my paper is still wet enough for me to add more paint without blooms forming, so things are in balance. But if I want to create some watercolour blooms for my background, I need to wait a bit. I don't want the paper to dry completely, as I won't be able to create the blooms I'm after, but I need to wait long enough, so I give it a few minutes. So to start with, I want to try getting some smaller blooms all over my background by flicking some water onto my paper using an old toothbrush. You can start to see the blooms developing quite quickly. It's not too easy to control exactly where the splatters go, and the blooms that you get are quite small with this method. So to get some bigger blooms and have a bit more control over where you get them, I go back to using my paintbrush. In this way you can be a bit more precise with where your blooms go, and just by varying the amount of water on your brush, you can also have a little bit more control over how big your blooms are. So if you want bigger blooms, you simply add more water to your paintbrush. And close up you can really see how easily this technique can add a really unique and interesting look to any painting. With the paper dry, as much as I'm really pleased with how it's turned out, I still think the background needs more contrast. So I add in some darker blue violet paint onto the dry paper and soften it out with a clean damp brush. I then decide to do the same on the browner areas of coral, but this time I pre-wet the paper underneath the clownfish and drop the darker paint onto the wet paper so I don't get any harsh edges. I don't want to cover up all of those blooms I created, but there's nothing to stop you repeating the same method again on subsequent layers, so that's what I decided to do. So I dropped in that dark brown paint mix onto the wet paper and let it bleed out. I also defined an area of coral on the bottom right hand side to help lead the eye into the centre of the painting, and added some of the blue violet mix as well. I then went back in with my toothbrush to add some more blooms. Now with the background dry, it was time to peel off that masking fluid and get painting our clownfish. I mixed up a really nice orangey red using vermilion hue and permanent yellow deep. Then I pre-wet the paper before adding in the first layer of that nice red orange mix. This is a fairly light first layer, but working wet in wet allows me to drop in some darker shades of burnt sienna and some more orange colours to build it up gradually. I also start to add in some markings on the dorsal fin and then begin to add in a lighter orange colour on the top of his body. When this first layer has dried, I then go in and re-wet the whole area again so that I can start adding in some more values. I add in darker oranges by the fish's pectoral fin and also some more orangey yellow values underneath the fish's belly. I then move on to the fish's face and work in the same way, so pre-wetting the area first with clean water before dropping in some of that nice orange-red mix. I then use the same technique to work the back of the fish and the tail, laying down clean water before then dropping in colour. For the next layer, once that's dry, it's time to really build up to that really nice orange colour that we know clownfish is for. So I start to add in more concentrated colours and build in some burnt siennas and some red as well. I also start to define the area around the fin, and I'm really careful not to go on the white areas. I continue to deepen up these orange areas and then let the painting completely dry. Now it's time to work on those white areas, and on my reference photo I noticed that they weren't actually white but had hints of blue and purple in them, where they were reflecting from the coral. So I used some of the same blue-violet mix I'd used earlier to paint that in. I pre-wet the paper with clean water and dropped this colour in carefully. I wanted to get a soft, even look without any harsh edges. I also dropped in some blue on top of the blue-violet mix. I think adding in this pale colouring really helped the clownfish look part of his surroundings. Now it's time to paint in his eye. I painted in the eyelid using burnt sienna and a very fine paintbrush. I'll fill in the pupil when that's dry. For the black stripes on the fish, I started out using a very concentrated blue ink as a base. I don't like to just use black as it can look a bit flat, so by putting a layer of blue underneath it helps give it a bit more life. I applied the same technique to his dorsal fin, laying down blue first and then layering over black on top. I then repeated this process for the rest of the black areas and filling his eye in between. Before adding the final black touches to the ends of the fins, I decided to go in and add a bit more detail. I used a fine paintbrush just to mark in some of those fin details using burnt sienna and some yellow ochre. And as much as I was quite pleased with how he was turning out, I did decide to then go in and add a glaze over the whole lot, so kind of vamping up those colours and making it a bit brighter. And I think this helped him to really stand out more from the blurry background. And as much as I'm adding more wet paint to my paper, I'm not going to get blooms like I did for the background because the layers underneath are completely dry. So if you don't like blooms or you want to avoid that effect in your painting, then do make sure that your layers underneath are completely dry before you add any more. So now it's time to add in that black paint on the top of the blue I put on the fins previously. For this I need to make sure that the areas underneath are completely dry, or else I'll get bleeding out of that black into the orange areas. The addition of that black paint really helps the fish to pop and stand out from the paper, but it also meant that you could barely see the shading I'd put on the white areas. So I went in and layered up another lot of blue-violet just to make those stand out again. I used the same method as I had before, but just made it a little bit darker so that it was visible. So I pre-wet the paper and then dropped in that blue-violet mix. For the really bright white areas, I used a damp brush to lift them out and a little bit of tissue as well. And I also left some white areas around the pectoral fins, and that really helped to make it all stand out and look really vibrant. And with that, this painting was complete. I really had a lot of fun with this one and think it's a really quick, easy and fun way to add some neat effects to your watercolour paintings, whether you're a beginner to watercolour or a bit more experienced. I'd love to know what you think of watercolour blooms. Do you love them or avoid them at all costs? Let me know in the comments box, as I'd love to hear from you. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please give it a thumbs up if you did, and subscribe to my channel if you'd like to see more. Hit the bell icon too to be notified of future videos. Thank you so much for watching, have a great weekend, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye!